So today I'll talk a little bit about how to grow blueberry plants. Now the first thing you want to do is figure out exactly how you're going to get the blueberry plants. Are you going to go ahead and start from cuttings? As some of you already know, I went ahead and took my blueberry cuttings and I grew them and gave them to friends. But they're going to have to wait a very long time before they start producing blueberries, and then before they start producing lots of blueberries. And so if you want to kind of jumpstart that situation, get blueberries a lot more quickly, then maybe going to a nursery or a home and garden store where they have the blueberry starter plants already, anywhere from, sometimes I see them as small as maybe 6 inches, and I've seen them as tall as 2-3 feet. So all depends on how much you want to spend and how quickly you want to get those blueberries. I remember when I started my blueberries, my garden blueberries, I think I bought the 3-foot plant because I was a little bit more in a hurry to get blueberries and I was willing to pay the price for them. But figure out exactly how much you want to spend, and if you want to start from, if you have an opportunity to start from cuttings, great. If you prefer to get the blueberries right away, go ahead and buy those at the nursery and home and garden stores, and you can buy the largest size they have. Now keep in mind that blueberries, in order for it to pollinate, you need to have 2 different varieties. You can go ahead and pollinate with the same variety, but you're only going to get less than half a yield than you would if you have cross-pollination. So just like apple trees, blueberries will go ahead and produce more blueberries, and it'll be more plentiful if you have different varieties. Also make sure that you look to see if it's an early, mid, or late season fruiting, blooming blueberry plant. Because let's say you get 2 blueberry plants and they're different varieties, but one blooms early and one blooms late, then you're going to have a hard time getting blueberries from either one. What I typically do is I like to get more than 2 varieties, 3 actually, at a minimum. So I'll have 3 different varieties of blueberry plants, all blooming about the same time. Now you might be able to get lucky on exactly how that works by going to your nursery or your home and garden store. A lot of times they'll go ahead and only have varieties that are very similar to each other and within the zone that you're living at. So sometimes they kind of take the guesswork out of that. Now the most important thing about blueberries is really actually really the soil. You have bad soil problems, whether it's in pots or in the garden, and it is just a huge recipe for failure. And so I really want to spend a lot of times talking directly about the soil or the effects of the soil has on something else. So like I think one of the earliest videos I ever did was about the yellow leaves on blueberry plants. And the leaf problem is not really a bug problem, but it was really a combination of the potting mix and how it was sitting in the soil. And so the soil in turn caused the yellowing of leaves and the green veins. And so let me talk a little bit about the prep work. So now you've bought your blueberries, you bought in different varieties. Hopefully they're flowering during a given season or given month that are in line with each other. So that way you don't have an early blooming and fruiting blueberry and a late one. And so that way you'll be able to get plentiful blueberries and fruiting blueberries. Now, whether you do pots or you do it in your garden, pick a sunny location because they do like a full sun. And once you figure out your location, if you're going to go ahead and plant your blueberries in pots like I did, blueberry plants actually have fairly shallow roots, but they do grow outward. So you want to go ahead and get a pot that is fairly wide, and you still want it deep because you want good drainage, right? Now the one thing about the soil is with pots, you're going to have the right potting mix or soil that you're going to prepare. So usually I take a wheelbarrow or I put some down, some tarp, and I go ahead and get the soil mixture ready. Now I'm in zone 8B, which is the Pacific Northwest. And we tend to have a lot of alkaline soil, plus naturally it just is more alkaline in our region. And so whether you're doing it in the ground or you're in the pot, you're going to have to go ahead and use or buy potting mix. and you're going to have to buy some other things to make sure that your soil is proper, so that way you have future success. Now with blueberry plants, they like a acidity level I know it's written down in a lot of places where they say that the acidity level should be a pH of about 4.5 to 5.5. But the more research I do, and the more I've read a lot of reports and talked to a lot of professional blueberry growers, is that range is actually a little bit more narrow than that. The range is usually about 4.3 to 4.8. That is the sweet spot. So you want to aim for somewhere between 4.3 on the pH scale to 4.8, which is very acidic. So blueberries are acidic loving plant. Now, if you get a little bit above that range or a little below that range, that's perfect, but it's better to shoot for a medium range that's a little bit more narrow, and if you get slightly outside that range, that's all right. Now, the reason I grew my blueberries in pots is actually blueberry plants are one of the few things that actually do better in pots. On top of that, in the wintertime, I'm able to move my pots around in an area that gets less wind and under the roof overhang, so that way not only gets shielded by a lot of the wind, too much rain, but I also have the opportunity to protect it from showers, diseases that fly around in the fall and the winter, but I still get a lot of sunshine if the sun is beaming down on a late winter day. Now let's talk about amending our soil. So what I do is with pots, potting blueberries, I use a ratio of 50% perlite, 30% 50% peat moss, 30% potting mix, and about 20% perlite. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is blueberry plants, although they like acidic soil, they also need to be well draining. There's nothing worse than having wet feet or wet roots and having soggy soil in your blueberry pot. And that will cause you to get not only root rot, but it also will drown the plant, and it won't be able to uptake the water properly in order to feed it properly, but also to take the acidity and take the nutrients from that soil and convert that photosynthesis and the sunshine into iron and allow it to basically feed itself. And so that's why a lot of people have problems with the leaves dropping and yellowing of leaves. It's not that they're overwatering or underwatering, but what happens is if they're drowning the roots or there's some sort of a deterrent to that, it can cause the uptake in that. And so it's kind of a domino effect. So for myself here in the Pacific Northwest, I do a ratio of 50% perlite, 30% potting mix, and I use a specific potting mix instead of just ground soil or topsoil, anything like that. And then I'll go ahead and add about 20% perlite just to give it that extra aeration and ability to drain a lot easier. Now, once you go ahead and pot your blueberries, or actually, let me take a step back. Peat moss in general is very, very dry, and most of the peat mosses I've bought, although they label the pH level to be acidic at somewhere between, I want to say between about 4.4 to as much as 5.5, 6-ish sometimes. I've done a pH reading on about 7 different varieties of sphagnum peat moss. And I'll tell you, yeah, I've never had it in the 4 range. The best I've had is probably, more like 5.2, 5.3. But most of the peat moss that I've gotten, and I bought in varieties, they're all hovering right around 5.5. So that's still fairly high for blueberry plants. And so that's why I go ahead and use so much peat moss in my potting mix. I know some people use a lot less percentage, but here in my area and based on the pH readings that I've done on both the potting mix and the peat moss, I realized I have to use at least 50% peat moss in my mixture. Now what I typically do is I'll take my peat moss, 50% peat moss, my 30% potting mix, and my perlite, and I'll put it in a wheelbarrow, and I wet that sucker down, and I let it sit there just soaking all that water for quite a few hours, because peat moss is something that takes a long time to absorb the water. a lot of times the water just runs off or just sits on top. So what I basically do is I get some gloves on. I put quite a bit of water in my wheelbarrow after I put in the potting mix and the peat moss, and I mix it in there, let it get soaping wet, and I let it sit there for a while so that way it does absorb as much water as possible. Then you can go ahead and before or after this process you can add the perlite and then mix it well. And then I'll go ahead and start putting it in my pots. I let it drain quite a bit just to make sure that the drainage is good, because there's nothing worse than oversaturating your pot. And blueberry plants don't like to have soggy soil on a constant basis. Not only will you get root rot, but the stems will, the main stem area between where the top ground soil is to where the roots are, they'll end up eventually rotting, and then your blueberry plant will just break off. So once you got the soil taken care of, then the question is exactly how much and how often do you water? Well, blueberries still like deep watering, but infrequently, meaning that I would recommend that you invest in a water stick or just put your finger into the soil and stick it about 2-3 inches deep. And if it's still moist, don't water. People tend to overwater things, and although we don't want to underwater, the overwatering situation is fairly bad for blueberry plants and other vegetables, so make sure you don't overwater. So if I put my finger inside there or use a meter stick and it shows that it's still moist, I'm not going to add any more. I'm not going to go ahead and water. And so I try to space out my watering as much as possible. Now, another thing to think about is the long-term effect of having alkaline soil, or your soil becoming more alkaline over time. Now, here in the Pacific Northwest, our soil is naturally somewhere between 7 and 7.5, and I've done a lot of pH readings on my soil here in the Pacific Northwest, and it's really running close. It's never better than 7.1, and so I'm really more hovering towards 7.5. And so if I don't add something to the mix or my soil to keep that soil more on the other side, a lower number, which is more acidic, my blueberry leaves are going to start falling off, or they're going to turn yellow because they're not going to be able to uptake those nutrients and convert it into energy and having nice green lush leaves. Now, I know most of you will go ahead and have heard that you're going to go ahead and use this thing called a soil acidifier. So whether it's in your garden or you're in pots, once or twice a year, you're going to go ahead and sprinkle soil acidifier into your soil, and it's going to acidify the soil. Now, for areas where the soil is naturally more acidic, or it's not hovering at 7 or higher, you can go ahead and use the soil acidifier, and these granules slowly over time will go ahead and keep that soil more acidic. Well, I've tried this method many times and for many years here in the Pacific Northwest, and with our soil above the 7 range, this has had very little effect on keeping the soil acidic in my area. And so with the natural rainwater, with the soil, with the other elements, with everything else going on, I have a hard time keeping the soil under 7. And I noticed that the soil acidifier in my garden area where I have a row of blueberries, this soil acidifier does basically nothing. There comes a threshold point where it just isn't able to turn the corner and lower the pH. Now, I've turned over to the aluminum sulfate, which can burn your plants, and so you want to be careful that you just keep, it's okay to use, but just make sure you don't overdo it. More is not better in a lot of gardening situations. So in my garden area along the fence line where I've shown you I've had blueberry plants, I'll go ahead and sprinkle aluminum sulfate around the blueberry area and into the ground to help continually acidify the soil. And also, because a lot of times I am watering my blueberry plants with tap water, which is more alkaline, and it leaches out all the nutrients that keep the soil in the pot more acidic, it will eventually go ahead and make my soil too alkaline. And so I too will take the aluminum sulfate and I'll sprinkle the aluminum sulfate on top of the pots and then water. So typically what I typically do is I take the recommended amount of aluminum sulfate. And I rather do a slow and longer approach. And so what I'll do is I'll take a spoonful of this, anywhere from half a cup to a full cup, and I'll sprinkle it into the pot, kind of work its way within the top 1 or 2 inches, and I'll water it thoroughly, or let the rainwater water it. And then I'll wait about a month and see how it is and how my pH reading. And so I may add aluminum sulfate throughout the bulk of the growing season on a monthly basis. But it's a good idea to invest in a pH stick and go ahead and monitor that. And they have these pH/watering sticks, so they're a dual combination. And I would recommend you go ahead and buy that, so you can, at the beginning, when you don't know much or don't know any better how to kind of tell if it's too damp or not damp enough or too soggy, you'll be able to use that water stick, test the water level, and see if you need to water it. Try to space out your watering as much as possible. Now, keep in mind with with tap water being more alkaline, every time you take your garden hose or you take tap water from the sink and you water your blueberry plants, it's going to go ahead and leach out the acidity in your soil. And it's also going to go ahead and not only leach it out, but it also with the water itself being more alkaline, it's going to turn this overall base of your blueberry plants with the soil and everything else in the pots. It's going to go ahead and naturally over time make it more alkaline. So that's why on a regular basis, if I see that, like for example next week it looks like it's going to rain quite often, I'm going to go ahead, and if I can water it and space it out properly and hit it just right, I may be able to not water for a couple days, and then when the rains come, with rain being slightly acidic, it'll naturally go ahead and rain and water my blueberry plants and help it keep more acidic. Now, if you have the yellowing of the leaves problems, I did a full video that really explains how to fix the yellowing of the leaves. Number one, you got to address the situation. Did the yellowing of the leaves occur because you're overwatering your blueberry pots? If so, then you may not have a pH problem. If you do have a pH problem, and if you don't take care of it within 1 season, your blueberry plants is more than likely going to die. It's something you cannot postpone. So like I told you before, that free blueberry plant that I got from my friend at the garden store, I went ahead and was able to turn it around very quickly because I went out and bought this thing called Chelated liquid iron, which is the ability to spray directly on the foliage, and it helps add the iron into the leaves and helps be able to draw up any acidity needs and the iron needs to help the photosynthesis problem and turn my leaves green. And that's why my plant here has green leaves now versus yellow leaves with dark green veins. Now, I do also fertilize according to the schedule. Now, a lot of times they tell you to fertilize maybe once or twice a season. Depending on how the season goes, I usually typically take this shake and feed, which I got for free. And as you can see, you can use it for blueberries. Now, you can buy specific blueberry fertilizer. I went ahead and I did that the first time, but I have a lot of blueberry plants, and that specific blueberry fertilizer is kind of expensive. So since I got this for free, I went ahead and I'm using this until I run out. Then I'll probably go ahead and go back to buying the specific blueberry fertilizer. But don't over-fertilize, don't under-fertilize. Do it based on its scheduling, and that will help keep your blueberry plants nice and healthy. Now, blueberry plants, as long as you do the prudent things, you kind of monitor it. It's not something like tomatoes where you have to actively manage it constantly to see if you have fungus, diseases, and other things. You can go ahead and kind of wait sometimes, or if you forget to go ahead and add the fertilizer exactly right before the first buds start breaking and the leaves start breaking, and you fertilize a week or two later, it's going to be okay. If you overwater or underwater once in a while, you're going to be able to be okay. I just won't do it all the time. So I try to make sure I stay on top of it. I have a kind of a cheat sheet scheduling on my blueberry plants, so that way I'm checking the pH reading. I'm adding the aluminum sulfate in my area, which is helpful for some of you who have planted your blueberries in the ground and you're in an area where there's more acidic soil. You can go ahead and do the slow releasing, safer organic soil acidifier. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about the garden itself. So if you're planting your blueberries directly in the garden, make sure you pick a sunny location. If you do it along the fence line and you're going to protect it a little bit from the wind in the wintertime, that would be great. If you don't, that's okay too. Now, you will need to amend your soil. Now, with garden soil, what I did was I went ahead and actually took out the first about foot of soil in my garden area. I probably took actually a foot and a half out. I know I have to pay more for it since I have to replace it. So I did a 50% Piedmont mix. I went ahead and used this Miracle-Gro potting mix, and I added about 20% perlite. And I know a lot of people don't add perlite to garden soil or a garden bed area, but I wanted enough drainage because my garden area is kind of on a slight slope, and so I was worried about getting root rot in the wintertime in the area I am. But even if I had a raised bed or a pretty flat area, I still like to add perlite because I like the extra drainage. Then after I went ahead and wet that soil down, mixed it really well, I actually added, at the time, I added soil acidifier into the mix. So that way it was keeping the soil acidified. Then on a regular basis, I realized that my pH was climbing and climbing, and then eventually it got to 7.5 and the soil acidifier was not working. So I realized that in my area, I needed to use aluminum sulfate. So I went ahead and switched over to aluminum sulfate. I did a slower approach at the beginning, although I did want to turn around my pH reading. I didn't want to overdo it because aluminum sulfate can burn. And so I did what was on the recommended amount on the sheet, and then I continually did a pH reading on a regular basis, maybe twice a week, to see if exactly it was turning around. It was turning around, but it was turning around pretty slowly, so I went ahead and hit it with another amount of aluminum sulfate. I watered the soil, let it work its way in, and then I regularly go ahead and add aluminum sulfate into my top portion of my soil in my garden area, and kind of work it in with kind of a 3-hole rake, and then I'll go ahead and water it down thoroughly. Now, in your area, if your soil is not as alkaline as mine here in the Pacific Northwest, where you're at exactly 7 or lower, you may be able to get away with not having to use aluminum sulfate. So that's something you'll have to kind of play with and see exactly how it is. I would definitely invest in a pH stick with a water stick combo, and that way you can go ahead and check to see exactly how your soil is in terms of does it need to be watered. If it can water naturally through rainwater, that would be great. You know, if you see that it's going to rain the next 2 or 3 days, you could go ahead and pre-plan your watering schedule to take advantage of that, which I am basically doing. Here in a couple more days, 2-3 days, it's going to start raining, and it'll rain on and off for the whole entire week. So I'll do my watering schedule and let the natural rainy day take care of that. I constantly make sure that I'm checking the soil acidity of the soil, because that is the #1 culprit for problems with blueberry plants. You'll have branch problems, leaf problems, fruiting problems, all based on the pH problem with the soil itself. So if you take care of your soil not only at the pre-planting period, but also the post-planting period, and just maintaining your blueberry plants, you'll have a very successful and healthy blueberry plant. This one here has a ton of flowers last week. And in June and July, I'm going to have a ton of blueberry plants from my dozen blueberry plants here in the yard. Constantly through the fruiting period, I'll hit it with a little bit of the shake and feed, which is a slow release. I went ahead and used this maybe a month ago, and it's probably been slowly working into the soil, but I'll probably hit it after it blooms and I start getting the first batch of blueberries. I'll probably hit it one more time with the shake and feed, and that'll be good for the rest of the season. I'll go ahead and not add fertilizer in the wintertime because I want it to kind of go into a dormant stage, and I don't want to keep it awake in the wintertime when it's cold outside. I want it to go into dormancy, and so I won't hit it with any fertilizer from late fall on. But that's a little bit about blueberries. There's not much more I can talk to you about other than that. You can add, one last thing is, in your garden bed, I do add either small size or medium size pine nuggets, because pine nuggets are acidic. It does take a long time to break down, so the amount that it helps in terms of acidity is not that great. Contrary to what a lot of reports say on the internet, it's great to go ahead and promote this because it sounds like a great idea, but the breakdown period and how long it takes for small nuggets and big nuggets to break down is so long that it's not going to do much effect in making your blueberry soil acidic enough. I do like it as a mulch feature to keep weeds away and to also keep bugs away. Also, another thing I forgot to tell you is, in your garden bed and even in your potting mix, over time the peat dissipates from your pots and from the garden, and especially in the garden where you have earthworms and other things, they will go ahead and eat away at your peat moss, and you'll end up with basically no peat moss inside your garden bed soil. It breaks down, it gets eaten up, and other things. And so I usually, in the late winter time, early springtime, I'll go through and add more peat moss. You know, I'll wet it down first, get it oversaturated, and then I'll scoop it up and add some more perlite to it and a little bit, a couple handfuls more of potting mix, and I'll go ahead and add that as a top dressing to my soil. I usually rake back my medium or small size nuggets first, so that way I'm putting it directly on there. And sometimes I'll even take a 1 to 2 inches of the topsoil away, so that way it's not like a raised bed getting higher and higher. Typically, just through water, through wind and other things, the soil kind of goes ahead and gets a little bit naturally lower. But I usually go ahead and take maybe 1 inch or 2 away every late winter, early spring, and I'll go ahead and dress my garden soil in my blueberry bed with additional peat moss, slash a little bit of perlite, a little bit of potting mix. And then I'll go ahead and acidify it by using aluminum sulfate in my area. But you can try soil acidifier first in your area if your pH in your soil is 7 or lower. Anything above 7, it has very little effect on acidifying your soil. And if you really have a very alkaline soil to begin with in your blueberry pots, then the soil acidifier is not going to be able to turn that around. Now, if you have further questions, things that are happening with your blueberry plants, let me know. Just send me a message and I'll try to help you out. I've taken a lot of sick blueberry plants. I've been given a couple of sick blueberry plants, and I've been able to turn them around. Go ahead and take a look at my very first video about blueberry plants. It should give you a lot of hints about the yellow leaves and the overwatering of your blueberry plants and the acidity level that is needed for blueberry plants. But that's kind of an overview of how to grow blueberry plants. If you have more questions, just let me know.